This is an exciting time in Scotland's story, and understanding our past will help us determine our future. And when Scotland's voice is heard, it charts the way forward. This is Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. Welcome to Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond, and to a very special programme celebrating the life and work of Winifred Ewing. Here in the Professor's Square at Glasgow University, it hasn't changed much since a day 70 years ago. A young woman proudly graduated from here with an MA LLB, Winifred Margaret Woodburn. She came on to be a lawyer of some note in the city of Glasgow as Secretary of the Bar Association. But it was 15 years later, in 1967, that she dazzled her way onto the Scottish political scene by storming the Labour citadel of Hamilton. And Scottish politics, indeed Scotland, has never been the same since. As Winnie Ewing, that lady went on to serve in 3 parliaments, in Westminster, in the European Parliament and in the Scottish Parliament, where famously from the chair in 1999 she declared that a parliament that was adjourned 300 years ago was hereby reconvened. So today we celebrate the life and work of Winifred Ewing. We speak to journalists, we speak to opponents and rivals, we speak to the family who knew her and loved her best. But first, over to Taz, who's going to tell us your reaction to last week's programme.
Thank you very much indeed, Alex. And now, from the echoes of cloisters here at Glasgow University to your response to our show last week on It's Scotland's Wind, the Offshore Bounty. And thank you so much indeed, all of those who have written into us. Here's just a few of my favourites.
First, to your tweets, Wolfie says it was very enlightening and informative. Comforting to know that at least Scotland now has a media that talks up Scotland. Ali says it was a right eye-opener. Makes your blood boil the opportunities lost to us. On the plus side, great wee snippets of our history as always. Mary says it was so refreshing and encouraging to hear a programme talking about Scotland's progress and potential. I'm already looking forward to next week's show. Steph says, thank you, enjoyed the show. Glad for the emphasis on not allowing the same mistakes to be made as with Scotland's oil and gas. Hope the government's paying attention. Also good to see expert opinion on the subject. As you say, much more analysis needs to be done to get this right. And now on to Facebook. Leslie says, first time in a long time I've seen such a good strategic long-term thinking for the people of Scotland. Very good show, well done. Elspeth says, at long last, an in-depth explanation of onshore and offshore energy and what it can do for Scotland. Can't wait for next week's programme. On YouTube, Hashbury says, excellent first show without political point scoring. Looking forward to next week's episode and tribute to Madame Écosse, Winnie Ewing. And finally, the Crimson Dragon says, I live in South East England, and as far as I'm concerned, Scotland is the future. Brilliant documentary, very well made.
And now to this week's show. Let us take you to the scenes of last Saturday at the Inverness Cathedral in the Highlands, when there was an outpouring of love and affection at the memorial service of the late, great, wonderful and much loved Dr. Winifred Ewing.
Away to the westward, I'm longing to be, where the beauties of heaven unfold by the sea, where the sweet purple heather blooms fragrant the dark island. Oh, while
Winnie could light up any campaign and any street. People often ask, what was her campaigning method? As if they could somehow bottle it and take it away. Her secret was simple. Winnie loved people, and they loved her back. It made her quite simply the finest election campaigner that Scotland has ever seen. Finally, her steadfast love of country and her pole star of independence. Thus, even opponents who vehemently disagreed still respected this, and then respected Winnie and therefore her cause. Fellow SNP members who argued with her, and there were a few from time to time, but they still liked her, and by and large, she liked them. All of this made Winnie Ewing the most significant Scottish nationalist of the 20th century.
seagulls in flight as they circle high above the dark island. Oh, while of my
By winning Hamilton, as Alex said, Winnie not only changed the face of Scottish politics, she changed the face of British politics forever. She catapulted the issue of Scottish independence from the periphery of Scottish politics into becoming the biggest issue of the day.
for me when I'm back once more upon the dark island.
And I'm joined by Ciara Ewing, who's Winnie's granddaughter. And of course, for those of you just seen the service, performed Dark Island. Now, that was a wonderful rendition,
Thank you.
unaccompanied of Dark Island.
Yeah.
So my first question, Ciara, is why did you choose Dark Island? Because it's not an easy song to sing.
Totally. I mean, for me, for starters, I was always into like the Inverclyde Music Festival and competing with singing, and Winnie was a massive champion of that, and she always loved hearing me perform and watching me act. That was always my thing. And in terms of performance for me, she actually watched me perform that song at the Inverclyde Music Festival, and I won a cup at the time, about probably the size as big as me, and she got a nice picture of me, you know, at the end, and for me it was just, I think it was something that she would want to hear on the day, so it was so lovely hearing it in the cathedral.
Well, your granny had a lovely voice, unlike your Uncle Fergus. Many a time your granny, when he was performing in Scots Way, he said, we'll have to do somebody else next year. But you've obviously inherited your granny's voice and more. What do you think, I mean, when you relate to your granny, would you see her just as, you know, Gran or Ewing, or how much consciousness did you have as you were growing up of what a huge political figure she was?
Well, I mean, there's no denying it. She was my grandmother, and she was an amazing woman at that. But she was also an icon, you know. I was talking to my sister earlier on today, and I was just reminding her of the time where I was at school. I was sitting in primary school, and my head teacher was like, so Ciara's actually going to get up on stage and talk about her grandmother, and this was new news to me at the time. And at 8 years old, I was thinking, oh my goodness, wait, what does my grandmother do again? And at the time, I just wanted to blend in, but I was made to stand up, go up in front of the whole school and say what she did. And my head teacher went, Ciara, so what does your grandmother do? Explain to everyone here. And I said, my grandmother runs Scotland. And yeah, as you can imagine, a few laughs were had, and she obviously properly explained what that meant. But at the time, that's what that was for me. And you know, I'm obviously the oldest grandchild of the four of us on both sides, and it's been such a pleasure to see obviously her political career, but also know her personally and see both sides of that. Like I've said, she's seen me sing, but I've also seen her sing as well on her own stage in her own way, and that's something that myself and my family and my siblings, you know, will always hold dear to our hearts, because it's so special to see a woman at that be so powerful and such a trailblazer in politics and pave the way for like Scottish politics as it is now.
And lastly, Ciara, during the service, I don't know if you heard the rolls of thunder on various occasions. Do you think that was your granny making an intervention?
Well, totally. In the taxi, let it be said, Annabelle said, Winnie, will you stop it for a second? As the heavens opened, because, you know, Winnie was, she was in the room, and you knew she was in the room, but for all the right reasons. One of the people speaking today in their eulogy said that she, you know, she had sheer audacity but she had audacity in every positive sense of the word. She was bold and courageous, and I think everyone today, that's exactly how they're going to remember her by. Yeah.
Ciara Ewing, Winnie's granddaughter, thank you so much
for
joining me in Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Coming up after the break, Alex will be interviewing the family of Winnie Ewing, who'll tell us about the mother and grandmother they loved so dearly. We'll see you then.
Hello, I'm Bernard Ponsonby. Remember to secure your tickets for The Eyes Have It, which will be playing at the Spiegel tent on the Fringe from the 4th to the 13th of August. It'll be rough, it'll be tough, but it will also be a good laugh. So get your tickets for The Eyes Have It. The Eyes Have It.
And now I'm delighted to be joined by Fergus Ewing, by Annabel Ewing, and by Terry Ewing, Winnie Ewing's children. Delighted to have you here in Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. Now, we're in this pretty majestic setting in Glasgow University. This is their trial courtroom, which no doubt your mother and many other law students have experienced. But what I want to ask you first is, what was it like as pretty small children when in 1967, when your mother burst onto the political scene, when you went from being, in a kind of normal Glasgow family to all of a sudden your mother becomes the most famous woman in Scotland?
First of all, at the school I was at, they had a day's holiday, so I suddenly became very popular, which was a surprise. And then my dad announced that he'd bet £200 that Winnie would win, and he got the odds of 9 to 1. And
I know a bit about that.
Well, indeed, but I think he spoilt the odds for you, Alec, if I may say so. So we all got enormous toys, which was quite pleasant, exciting. But life changed because we realised, I was 10, Annabel and Terry younger, but she was the woman in Scotland. She was, for those years, the most famous woman in Scotland, and that of course changed life for us all.
No, Annabel, as Fergus has gallantly said, much younger, but what was it like for you?
Well, I was 7 when Mum was elected, and I do recall that evening that she was going to the count in Hamilton, and I wasn't allowed to go because I had a cold, whereas Fergus was allowed to go, excuse me, so I felt very aggrieved from an early age about things that my big brother got to do that I wasn't getting to do. However, moving on to the next day, I do remember the house in Queen's Drive was full of people. It was just full of people. There was journalists, there was family friends, there was relatives, there was political people that Mum had been campaigning with. And it seemed to go on like that for days. I presume it didn't, but I also remember that I was tasked to do a book review by the Evening Standard. And I was given this awful book, and I remember it, having to sit in a corner sort of reading this terrible book. And eventually I had to do the review, and I wasn't given any help at all.
So you were given this review to do as a child?
Yes, at 7 years old, and it was children of famous people. So I was given no help, and I started off the book review. This is the most boring book I have ever read. It took me 3 whole days to read. So that's my first memory of life changing.
I don't think you spelled whole correctly.
I didn't, H-O-L-E. I got better at school. But that was the first memory I have. I don't know Terry's first.
That spelling's no good to this day. But Terry, you were virtually a babe in arms. So do you have any real memory of Hamilton 67?
I remember people, parties, joyous occasions. I remember in particular the House of Commons became my playground for hide and seek with the policemen. And life, the extraordinary was my life. As I could only reflect on that really in my mid-teens looking back, that we had this incredible upbringing where, as you highlighted, my mother was one of the most famous people in the country and everybody knew her. So everybody wanted to talk about her and everybody wanted to talk to us. So I thought that was absolutely normal as a child growing up into this because I knew nothing else.
So your mum took you to the Commons a fair bit. I mean, the Commons have very few facilities for families. I mean, there was a family room, which was quite a depressing place actually, but so your mum took you regularly to the Commons?
Indeed, but my father always took me to Hamley's first of all.
The toy shop.
To make sure I was occupied once we reached the Commons. And that plan worked pretty well because I turned up in the Commons wearing a different outfit, usually a policeman's outfit, but sometimes something else. And the policemen find that hilarious, of course. So I then was in charge of making sure the security was in force for the strangers bar and entrance to it. And occasionally I was known to thump a cabinet minister with my plastic truncheon.
So let's move on for your mum's career, through its ups and its downs and recoveries, and particularly thinking about the move to the northeast of Scotland, to Murray and Nairn. I mean, your mum committed herself to the seat. She unseated the sitting Secretary of State for Scotland, Gordon Campbell, famously in February 1974. Did you decamp it as a family? What do you remember about the Murray and Nairn campaign? Presumably you were all recruited to the cause.
We did decamp, and one of the things that she and her dad did was to purchase a wee house, a modest wee house in the square in Lossiemouth, which she called the Goodwill, named after a local skipper's fishing vessel. And she immediately got in with all the fishing community very quickly, and it showed she was serious. She was making a commitment. She was making a point. Look, I'm not from here, but I'm going to be of you and of the community. And it was an amazing victory. I mean, the plan was hatched up by others that she would take the attention away from the other 2 seats that we won because they were reckoned to be the easier ones. But of course, she confounded the pundits and she beat the Secretary of State for Scotland. Her second quite remarkable victory.
Annabel, how did you find the northeast after Glasgow?
Well, I really enjoyed the connection we had to have with Murray and Lossie in particular, and I remember very well the wee cottage, the Goodwill, and being part of that community. I mean, I still went to school in Glasgow, but you inevitably were up there holidays, weekends, and I really enjoyed it. Lossie has 2 fabulous beaches, most beautiful place. The people were very welcoming to us, and we were part of the fixtures and the firmament of Lossie, and I was involved with the Twin Town Association between Lossie and Hersbruck in Bavaria, and was involved in that for about 4 years whilst I was a school kid learning German, so that was all very useful. And it was I'm from Glasgow, I see myself as a Glaswegian, but my connection with Murray is very strong indeed, and I'm very grateful to have had that experience in my life.
Terry?
I think looking back, I think what made the difference was that my mother realised that she was this outsider, and people in Murray are quite canny about who they welcome. And looking back, she made a very smart decision to go on that Goodwill boat for a week with the fishermen, which Alex, is no small order of a task.
Especially for a woman, because women traditionally didn't go on fishing boats.
So I think after that, the locals realised that this woman's serious, this woman's here to stay, And I think that translated into the success that she had.
She was also a lavish party giver. And I mean, the living room in our wee cottage in Lossiemouth was about half the size of this. It was very small, but she could still pack in about 60 people, piper, violinists, and quite incredible. And we could probably have applied to Guinness Book of Records, actually, for the longest and the most populous ceilidhs in the smallest space.
Well, I noticed your mum's autobiography, I think it's dedicated to pipers everywhere, because she was probably piped into more functions and more places than any other person in history. Would that be right?
Absolutely. I think one of her real qualities to me was her kind of absolute certainty of her convictions and moral courage. And, I think we all know in politics that occasionally a moment comes where if you don't grasp that moment, you miss it. If you don't have the courage to grasp it. And that takes us to the European election, where she was regarded as as almost certain to lose to Russell Johnson. And the Saturday before polling day, it was a Shinty Cup final in Owen. There was a very large stand, fully attended. Mum was in the stand. And lo and behold, Russell, who was very ill willing with the Camanachd Association, was part of the welcoming party. And so he was going out to meet all the players and be seen by everybody to be in with the bricks and the man. And Winnie realised immediately she was being snubbed and she wasn't having it. So when she was wearing high heels, she teetered down from her seat on the stand and she effected what is perhaps the one and only ever political campaign pitch invasion. And people started laughing. But they weren't laughing at her, they were laughing with her. And I think that was the moment, Alec, when they thought, if she's got the guts to do this, then she's got the guts to speak for us in Europe, because she won't take being snubbed. And that means a lot to people in the islands.
Something else about that story, isn't there, Annabel and Terry? I mean, the press, the established press, all poo-pooed her. I mean, they thought this was, this is brass neck to the nth degree. She's surely finished now. But that's not how it turned out.
No, not at all. I mean, they just didn't really understand how inspiring a woman my mother was, and she inspired other people, and they didn't really get that. And they just assumed that this would all kind of come to an end at some point in terms of her political success, and of course it didn't. And when she was elected to the European Parliament, the first direct elections in 1979, some short weeks after she had lost her seat in the House of Commons, in the UK general election, she went on each subsequent European Parliament election to vastly increase her majority. So her popularity did not wane. It substantially increased year on year. And I think that's because basically she walked in other people's shoes. She stood up for other people, and they knew that she would do that. And she did it without fear or favour. And she did it without, whichever authority it was, people knew that if they had rights that were not being observed, that Winnie would stand up for them. And I think that is why she was so popular.
Terry, you connection your mum with Europe. Famously in the Buchan Observer, I saw a headline saying, Europe is her meter. What was it, this association between your mother and the European Parliament and the engagement with so many countries? What was it?
I think if you look back, if you look back at my mother's upbringing, she was a young girl during the war years. Both her brothers were involved in the war, one sadly in a Japanese prisoner of war camp. And that had a deep-seated impact, as it did in that whole generation, of the need to collaborate, to work together, to try and get on without conflict. And she carried that through, I think, into the idea that countries needed to work together. And in the end, she found the European Parliament a much more friendly chamber to try and use the power of argument to get legislation through, which we both know is not the modus operandi, sadly, in the other two parliaments where there's a lot of conflict. So that is what she was inspired by, I think, and her power of connecting with people allowed her to connect with her argument, to persuade others to get Objective 1 status for the Highlands and Islands, for instance, as part of one of the many things that she achieved in the European Parliament.
And Madame Écosse, Annabel, where did that title come from?
I think actually, was it not a column in Le Monde, I think, a newspaper?
Where else?
Well, where else? And it was because everybody in the European Parliament knew, and some have, former MEPs have contacted me since my mother's death and expressed their condolence, but also remembered the amazing woman that my mother was. And she was known to, steadfastly, single-handedly stand up for Scottish interests. And she did that day in, day out, and that is why she earned that sobriquet, that title, because everybody identified her as representing the people of Scotland and doing it in terms of the comments I've received since her death very well indeed.
Fergus, tell me just a bit about your dad in this. I mean, he seemed to be in the engine room making this full Ewing political dynasty work. What was your dad doing when all this was happening?
Well, I think he was forking a lot of money. He once told me rather ruefully, Alec, that when we were all in Hamilton, he told me some years later that she spent each month on clothes a sum equivalent to the average annual male earnings in Scotland. And he said that with feeling some pain behind it. But he
was an accountant.
He was an accountant and a tax lecturer, and he himself actually stood for the council. He stood on the basis that he would lose because he didn't want to win because he already had so many other commitments. Yeah. But of course, being dad, he won. But there is a lovely story about...
And unseated a big figure in the Labour Party, if I remember that.
Sitting Bailey.
Big dimes. They were both very unhappy at the result. But on the Saturday before, the Friday, Saturday before the poll, Winnie said, "Right, Stuart, we're going for a pub canvass," which is probably the last thing they wanted to do. So they went to the Viking Bar in Maryhill, and there was a group of ladies having a nice, enjoyable evening out and a drink or three. And so Winnie just breezed in and said, "Ladies, I'd like you to meet your candidate, my husband, Stuart." And there was this long pause when they surveyed Stuart, who really wasn't one of life's natural Casanovas, I think you would say. And one of the ladies broke the silence by saying, "Winnie, are you boasting or apologise?"
Now, I'm going to ask you well, first I want to ask you about the fact that obviously you both followed your mother into politics. You, Annabel, in 2 parliaments, you just in the one, Fergus. Your mother, of course, was in 3. So, what was there kind of inevitability that once you got entranced in this political operation that you would want to stand at the end of the day? You first, Annabel.
I guess looking back, it probably was inevitable. I think, certainly speaking for myself. Even at the end of the day, if we'd had a different view about the best future, the best path for Scotland, that would have been our view, and we would have argued for that position, but we didn't. We had the same view. We came to the same opinion that the best future for Scotland was to take our own decisions and be a normal, independent country. And whilst we were all very involved in campaigning from a very young age and delivering leaflets and doing all of the electioneering, I certainly for myself had perhaps put off the moment that I would become more involved in the front line. I worked in Brussels for 10 years as a lawyer. And I knew, though, that when I came back home, that moment would come, that I would put myself forward to be selected as a candidate for the SNP. And that is what I did, and fought many elections thereafter, and then was, of course, a colleague of yourself, Alec, in the House of Commons between 2001 and 2005.
Very good colleague you were too. Your sister's answered for you, Fergus, but I'm interested, Terry, you didn't. Why not? Why didn't you tread that well-worn Ewing path into politics?
You'll not be surprised to hear that being brought up in the Ewing household, politics was foremost conversation and topic, and there was no getting away from that. I was immersed in it, but I had 35, 40 years of campaigning, but like most of the folk in the SNP, it was in the background helping the leafleting, the knocking on doors, the canvassing and so on. So I had many, many years of doing that, and delighted to do that to try and get these kind of guys elected. But I then moved abroad. Funnily enough, ended up in Ireland with my Irish wife. Ireland is booming, and I find myself even more frustrated today looking at the success story of Ireland. We've just set up a sovereign wealth fund, and I find it immensely frustrating, and it burns the desire for Scottish independence in my heart more than ever.
The last time I'm going to ask you the most difficult question of all, and I'll start with you again, Terry. What was your mum's magic? I mean, she's the most successful electoral campaigner in Scottish history. What was the magic touch?
So I think whether it's speaking to a coal miner in Hamilton or a fisherman in Lossiemouth, she was able to walk into a room and immediately make that connection. And it was sincere, it was deep-rooted. She, unlike yourself, was able to make a mark early in terms of her argument, and she convinced many of the cause of Scottish independence through sheer will at times. That was a constant. And it didn't matter if it was a laird, cabinet minister, life peer, or coal miner, she was still able to make that connection and usually succeed in the art of persuasion.
Annabelle?
Yeah, I absolutely agree with all that. What I would add is, and it's actually a card I received from the mother of a friend of mine, and this woman is of ages with my mum, had been brought up in the south side of Glasgow, and she wrote me this card, and she said that from her perspective, my mother was an outstanding woman, and that this lady who kindly took the trouble to write the card to me said that she assumed that actually most women in Scotland would be proud of Mum because my mother spoke for women. And I think that had a lot to do with her success.
Lastly, Fergus?
Well, there hasn't really been a week in my life that's gone by in the Highlands, representing the Highland constituency, where someone hasn't come up and said to me, I remember that night we spent with Winnie, or I remember when she stood up for us in the European Parliament. And when they're telling me these stories, there's always one common strand that it's Winnie, it's never a politician. She was Winnie, the person, the human being. And most people in politics, at best, are respected, but Winnie was loved. And that's still palpable today.
Fergus, Annabelle, Terry, thank you so much for sharing your thoughts about your mother, Dr. Winifred Ewing.
Thank you.
Order! Order! Hello, I'm Eleanor Lang. I'm the Deputy Speaker of the House of Commons, and I'm massively looking forward to coming to a great show in the Fringe in the Spiegel tent from the 4th to the 13th of August. It's going to be raucous, it's going to be rough, it's going to be full of political argument, and we need you to be there with us. So come and join in this fascinating event. It's called The Eyes Have It. The Eyes Have It. I hope you'll join us.
Now I'm delighted to be joined by Winnie Ewing's granddaughter, Natasha. Natasha, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks, Alec.
Now, I'm interested, when you were thinking about your granny Winnie, were you aware of what a famous politician she was? At what stage did you suddenly realise that your granny was famous?
I only realised when I was around 9 years old, because I was forced to go to the 50th anniversary of Hamilton, which I was very against going to. But I was
against
bribed.
going to it? Why was that?
I'd rather stay at home and watch TV and play with my toys and my games.
Very
at
sensible,
that point.
very sensible. But you got dragged along
Yeah.
to the 50th anniversary of Hamilton, and what did you find?
I kind of realised how important she was, though I wasn't really paying attention to most of it. Though I did convince my dad to get me budgies that day, so I thought that was the biggest success of the night.
Well, and then you thought, my goodness, I never really thought about my granny as an amazingly important politician. So did that change your attitude to your granny, or was she just the same?
She was just the same. I mean, I didn't really know what to say to her at that point. I mean, most of her memory was kind of going at that point, so what was I going to do? Talk about Hamilton? Also, I wasn't really interested with all the political talk I get at home, so...
Would you get too much at home, yeah?
Yeah.
So are you suggesting at this time there's no chance of you following in this distinguished line of politicians like your granny, your father, your auntie? Are we going to have Natasha Ewing on a ballot paper anytime soon?
I doubt it.
Is your mind up to be changed, or it's a woman's prerogative after all?
It might change when I get older, though I doubt it will.
And so did have they kind of, apart from, boring the pants off you in terms of conversation, I mean, if they had you leafleting and stuff like that, yes, well, that must be a bit irritating. I mean, do you get paid for this leafleting, and is it declared on the election returns?
No.
What do you, when you think about the memories of your granny Winnie, what do you think about?
Well, I don't really have many memories of her when she was like quite able and stuff, when she wasn't, you know, just getting a bit older. Most of my memories are just when I would go and visit her while she was in her homes, and then we would just chat about, you know, just normal things. Politics was never really brought up, apart from when my dad was saying how much everyone hated them and stuff.
So your dad was looking to his mother. Well, when you're in trouble, Natasha, your mother is the person you go to above all, so that's pretty sensible. You know, what should I do now? I can imagine. Natasha, I knew your granny when she was in full flow, and believe me, she was some lady. Thank you so much for joining me on Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond.
Thank you.
In today's politics, too much debate is reduced to a couple of echo chambers not talking to each other. Real debate is about engaging, arguing, strongly but in a civilised manner. And at the Edinburgh Festival this year, in the Fringe, Alex Salmond and I are going to be debating the big issues of the time, ranging from Brexit to Scottish independence, from the right to strike to the monarchy. Come and join in, come and enjoy it. The ayes have it, the ayes have it.
Welcome back to Glasgow University, the alma mater of Winnie Ewing, who of course enjoyed a long political career. There are two people still very active in the world of journalism and academia who followed that career right the way through. Over to Alex.
Now, for an insight into Winifred Ewing's life and work, I'm going to be joined by two people who covered it in one way or another right through that entire 4-decade period. I'm joined by distinguished journalist Magnus Linklater and distinguished academic Owen Dudley-Edwards. Firstly to you, Magnus, you were already working as a journalist when Winnie spectacularly swept onto the political scene in Hamilton in 1967.
I was indeed, but I was well distanced from Scottish politics. I was on the London Evening Standard. I was a cub reporter on the Londoners' Diary, which was a gossip column. But the arrival of this party of half of Scotland, it seemed to me, on the train from the north was a big event. And as a Scot, I felt I really needed to be there, and so I persuaded my editor to send me along to Euston Station, and I never got near her. The crowds were enormous, but all I could hear was the skirl of the pipes and this figure hoisted onto the shoulders of people carrying her. And this was a Scottish nationalist MP, newly elected, coming down to London. And I was non-political at the time, remained so ever since, I hasten to say, but I felt a real sense of pride on that occasion at this very, very Scottish scene and this Scottish heroine arriving to represent Scotland.
Now, what was your first interaction with the great Winnie Ewing? When did that happen?
Well, first of all, I was covering in the late 60s, early 70s, covering SNP and conference for the Irish Times. I was teaching at the University of Edinburgh at the time, but I'd previously been in the United States and taking part in the civil rights movement and so forth. So from my point of view, what came into perspective was somebody who clearly was changing history, as I had seen in America, other somewhat slighted, indeed very slighted, ethnic and national groups and so forth. But here, a personality of extraordinary warm quality, one of the most remarkable people in Scottish history, one of the most formidable, and one of the most lovable. I first met her on a television show where another hero of mine was also performing, and that was one of the greatest novelists Scotland has ever produced, Magnus's father, Alex Linklater. And the warmth and the kindness of Winnie, yes, because she was a tremendous historical event, because there's no doubt about it, because of her election and how brilliantly she campaigned thereafter and the breadth of her understanding. Therefore, Scottish history began to re-emerge. Scotland stopped being an invisible country, and she is the person who set that in motion.
Well, your secret's out, Magnus. You may be an impartial journalist, but both your father, Eric, the great novelist, and of course your mother, Marjorie, were dedicated Scottish nationalists. Did none of that rub off on you?
No, it hasn't, Alec, and I want to make that clear. However, you're quite right. My mother was a very close friend, and Winnie, in her autobiography, says that Marjorie, my mother, was her closest friend in Orkney, and Marjorie became the SNP agent. And she told me once quite a revealing thing about Winnie. She said, you know, when I was questioning her about her political allegiance, she said, well, I support independence entirely because of Winnie, because Winnie has convinced me that an independent Scotland would not only be exciting, but it would be fun. Now, you don't hear that message very often these days, but that was what my mother was loved a party, loved fun, as did Winnie, and the two got on famously together. But on one occasion, I remember Winnie coming up to Orkney and saying, so how's the SNP cause coming on in Orkney? And my mother said, well, not very well, Winnie, I'm afraid. And I'm just wondering if winning over the youth movement is best done by an 88-year-old election agent. And Winnie, who was nearly 70 herself, said, nonsense, you're just the right person, Marjorie.
I want to ask you, Owen, Winnie's connections with Ireland, Winnie had a deep love of Ireland, which she speaks about in the autobiography that Magnus mentioned. What's your memory of the interchange between Winnie and key Irish politicians?
One obviously was Hugh McDermott, whom I had the very great honour to know, took essentially in his life the argument Scotland is being parochialised, indeed removed almost entirely from consciousness by its subservience to English culture. Now, Winnie expressed that idea when she won the election, saying, stop the world, Scotland wants to get on. And that internationalism was at the root of her nationalism. And Ireland was the nearest thing to hand. Now, many SNP people were frightened of Ireland because of the appalling slaughter which had been created in the south and then in the north as well. And naturally, it wanted to stay away from anything like violence, and Winnie certainly did. But she was most interested in the way in which things were working out, came over to Ireland at an early stage after her election, and was interviewed by De Valera, now retired from politics officially, as Prime Minister, as President, where he had formerly been Taoiseach or Prime Minister. And she, in talking to me about De Valera, she brought him to life tremendously well. She was a terribly good witness to history, one reason why she made such an important contribution to it. She could describe things and you felt you were there. In this case, it was a little bit more than the I Came to Ireland, because after meeting De Valera, she then was asked to take part in the RT, Radio Television popular show, Gay Byrne's That Was the Week. And when she'd been on it, Gay Byrne, who was a very practiced and very clever,
supercilious, as I remember.
Well, the real expression we have is that he was used to putting everything in the lowest common denominator, so that he couldn't take Scottish nationalism seriously. Oh, that was something we had in Ireland. If there was anything in Scottish nationalism, it couldn't be important. Winnie stood her ground. But afterwards, when she went to get her plane, she got at Dublin Airport at Collinstown, suddenly boomed out, would Mrs. Winifred Ewing please come to the telephone where on Uachtaráin, Damon de Valera wishes to speak to her. And Dev was at the other end of the telephone. Now, of course, because he was blind, while she had been very impressed by him, suddenly she was getting him, hearing him, and she heard tremendous passion, his grief that a representative of the Scottish nation that she had shown herself to be should have been slighted in this way. Dev saying, you understand, I'm simply only the president. I cannot control what is said on these occasions, but I deeply apologise to you in the name of Ireland. Now, in a way, that started Winnie's relationship with Ireland, because she learned at an early stage to study Ireland to see what Scotland could do in international affairs. And it turned out there she met formidable allies in the European Union.
So does it surprise you, Magnus, to find out that Madame Écosse got an apology from the President of the Republic for the conduct of a journalist?
Only Winnie. Only Winnie could do that. But the thing about her, which I just want to add to what Owen has said, is that she made friends across all the party divide. I mean, she loved, she was a great friend of Harold Wilson, for instance. Not many people in the SNP would share that view. But she was also great friends of, for instance, someone like Sir Fitzroy Maclean, the great historian, also a Conservative MP. And she made no distinction. She was as happy in the House of Lords, having tea with their lordships, as she was in the House of Commons, having tea with her SNP colleagues. She had a great gift of friendship, Winnie, and I think that's almost the key to her political success. Wherever she was, and we've heard some stories about her walking into a bar and she would immediately be able to talk to people. She could cut across social divides and bring the best out of other people.
Well spoken. Owen, that stood her in good stead, the gregarious and generous nature of Winnie's spirit. Did you experience that personally?
Oh yes, but as far as our relationship with Ireland was concerned, she studied Ireland, which taught her, among other things, and the Irish diplomats, and when she got to know them, Irish European politicians, were don't waste your time simply trying to do business within the public halls. Meet people at the bar. That is essential. Get to know them, get to be friendly with them. Well, she certainly did that. She was tremendously proud of the fact that she introduced Ian Paisley to Sheila de Valera, de Valera's granddaughter. And of course she was dead right. Both of them needed to get together. This is a good auspice for them to do it, because Winnie diagnosed that particularly the Highlands and Islands had many of the same problems as the periphery in the Republic of Ireland did, and as Northern Ireland did. So peripheral groups like that found a new identity from her, and she evidently acted very much as a peacemaker among them. And from that point of view, she showed what being a good European meant, because of course she learned one essential thing from Ireland. You are one of a cooperative commonwealth, all the different countries within the European Union. You are not simply a shade of an old empire in sector demanding deference.
Right, guys, the most difficult question of all, and in a phrase, Winnie's impact on Scotland and Scottish politics.
I think she led to the resurgence of the Scottish National Party. It all begins with her. And if you look back, she was the one who brought it to public attention, showed that it had an impact, and made it a political force.
And Owen, the most difficult thing for you, in a phrase, Winnie?
Incomparable. She did stand perfectly within the tradition of development of world politics and helping the smaller people, or what seemed the smaller people, but above it all, she did it in what was entirely her own way, and it was because of that courage, spirit, and charm that she was able to take Scottish nationalism and transform it in Scotland, in Britain, and in the world.
Gentlemen, thank you so much, Magnus Linklater, Owen Dudley-Edwards, for your memories and reflections on Winifred Ewing.
I'm Michelle Thompson, the SNP MSP for Falkirk East. Now you know, wherever there's a debate to be had, be it about Scottish independence, about Brexit or anything to do with Scotland, I'll be there. And you need to be too in this year's Edinburgh Festival Fringe at the Spiegel tent between the 4th to the 13th of August. It's going to be tough, it's going to be rough, but a lot of fun. Make sure you come along and put me on the winning side for the Eyes Have It, the Eyes Have It.
And I'm joined by Alec Neil, sometime political opponent, then political ally of Winnie Ewing. Alec, welcome to the Scotland Speaks with Alex Salmond. Now, you and I had the great task, the great pleasurable task of performing the obituaries at Winnie's memorial service last Saturday. And I think we both had the experience of, what on earth could we leave out of telling the story of this remarkable woman? What for you was the key part of Winnie's success and charm?
She was a one-off, Winnie, completely one-off. First of all, she was a very, very intelligent lady. I mean, she was 38 when she won the Hamilton by-election, but by that time she was a leading lawyer in Glasgow, which in those days for a woman to be president of the Law Society, the president of the Bar Association in Glasgow, and also she'd been the secretary for a number of years of the Bar Association, and at the time of Hamilton, she was actually studying for the English bar already, having been accepted into Gray's Inn. So the first thing about Winnie Ewing is that she was a very intelligent lady. And the second thing was she was a character. She, what you knew when Winnie was in the room, and she was a brilliant person at working a room and persuading people of her point of view.
Now, we're here at Glasgow University, but one of the characteristics of Winnie is that she didn't cut her teeth as a great debating star in this university, as so many others have done. Donald Dewar, you think of John Smith, people like that. She actually cut her teeth more in the Glasgow Sheriff Court, which is a hard school.
Absolutely, and of course the by-election really was the first major campaign where she had been a candidate in such a high-profile position. And of course she just absolutely, completely snookered everybody else in the campaign because she was so good. And the word I used in my obituary was that she was audacious. Now that doesn't mean that she was aggressive or she was arrogant. She was anything but aggressive or arrogant, but she was daring, she was bold, she would go in and do things no other candidate of any other party would even think of doing. She was somebody whose character, force of character, along with her intelligence, was an incredible combination, a unique combination.
Now, back in '67, obviously as an infant prodigy, but you were in the Young Socialists, you're in the Labour Party. So you're in a good position to say, what kind of seismic shock was it to Labour that they lost their second safest seat in Scotland?
It was a massive shock. The Labour Party establishment just didn't believe that they could lose a seat like Hamilton. It was a typical mining area, it was in Lanarkshire, the heart of Labour politics, along with Glasgow in Scotland. And in fact, if you read the autobiography of Tam Dalyell,
my old friend.
Absolutely, and Tam records the fact that he was out campaigning with John P. Mackintosh about a week before polling day. And they very quickly realised that this election was not going Labour's way. And he went back to the campaign rooms in the Labour Party and told Willie Ross, the Secretary of State for Scotland, that there was a good chance the SNP would win this by-election, to which Willie, in typical Willie fashion,
Basso
Profundo, gruffly said, "Don't be silly." And of course, Willie was wrong and Tam was right. And Tam was right because the people had had enough of Labour thinking that they own the people. And it's a lesson to be learned by every political party in every age. If you become too arrogant and you lose touch with the people, you're not long until you lose power as well.
A lesson for all politicians.
Absolutely.
Of course, Labour didn't take kindly to this defeat, and Winnie got a torrid time in the House of Commons.
I mean, it was a small number of Labour MPs, mainly Scottish Labour MPs. And of course, I think they were jealous of Winnie because she was much more effective. She was getting masses of publicity. She had a column almost from day one every week in the Daily Record. She had another column in the Daily Express in Scotland.
The two biggest selling
Two
papers.
biggest selling papers, read by the traditional Labour voters. They were the papers in those days that Labour voters read in Scotland. So the backlash against the Labour Party from the stuff that Winnie was finding out and propagating had a major impact, not just on public opinion, but as a result of that, a lot of Labour MPs began to resent Winnie, and a number of them took that resentment to the point of being absolutely more than obnoxious to her in the House of Commons. And it took Harold Wilson, who was a very kind man, it took Harold Wilson personally as Prime Minister and leader of the Labour Party to intervene, and he immediately put a stop to it.
So, of course, when he lost Hamilton in 1970, they must have all thought, well, we've seen the back of her then. It didn't turn out like that.
Well, the first thing to say is that Winnie, obviously the SNP had only ever won a by-election, and that was when Robert McIntyre won in 1945 in Motherwell, and he was in the House of Commons for 3 months and lost the seat in the general election. And there had been no other SNP representation till Winnie came along. Since Winnie came along, the SNP has never been without parliamentary representation at Westminster, and have now, of course, the Scottish Parliament, where we're by far the biggest party. So the reality is that Winnie's victory in Hamilton kick-started the modern SNP and the rejuvenation of the independence movement. And I don't think, actually, since Culloden, that Scotland had been spoken about as much at Westminster as happened after Winnie's victory. And in fact, globally, Winnie made an impact, because people in America, people in Russia, people in Canada, people in Australia, they all suddenly realised there was a country called Scotland. And that's never ever died away. So she was historical in her impact. It's long term, the impact that Winnie had in Scottish politics and on British politics.
Now, you've been in a few campaigns, Alec, as I have. What do you think was the key ingredient? What was the secret of Winnie Ewing's success?
Well, in one of the newspapers after Hamilton, somebody addressed this issue and said that the unique point about Winnie was that she was able to woo voters in a way that no one else could. I mean, she is the best political street campaigner that Scotland has ever produced, with all due respect to yourself and to many others who in the SNP and in other parties have been very effective. But Winnie is in a class of her own in terms of effectiveness as a street campaigner. And this article in this newspaper, way back in just after she had won Hamilton, described her as Winnie the Woo. She wooed everybody, and no one else could woo like Winnie.
Now, Alec, finally, Winnie's looking down on us, and she's seeing these accolades and tributes from across the political spectrum, unionist and nationalist, left and right. What would she be thinking?
Well, I think the first thing she would say, let's have a party, because she was a party animal, and that was all part of her makeup. You know, Winnie was a social person. She liked people, and didn't matter their politics. She liked talking to people. She liked discussing things with people and all the rest of it. So I think the first thing, she'd been very proud of all the tributes that had been paid to her, and I think probably very honoured about all the tributes that have been paid to her. But I think if she was looking at the political situation in Scotland, she would be a bit concerned about the state of not so much support for independence, which is holding up fine, but she'd be certainly concerned about the state of the national movement at the current time. And I think the one thing she would be telling everybody in the national movement, irrespective of party, irrespective of personality, irrespective of anything else, she would say, listen to what the people are saying. Listen to what the people are saying and follow the people, because that's what she did. She could read people like no one else. She understood what people were thinking, and she then knew what to do about it to woo people to her cause. And I think she'd be very happy, she'd be very proud, she'd be delighted, she'd be ready for a party, but at the same time she would be pointing the finger and saying, make sure you don't make the same mistake the Labour Party made in Hamilton and ignore the people.
Alec Neil, thank you so much for appearing on Scotland Speaks.
Pleasure.
Alex Salmond.
Pleasure.
Winifred Margaret Ewing. What a life and what a woman. From Westminster to Brussels to Holyrood, across 3 parliaments and 4 decades, and a star in each of them. Winnie never achieved ministerial office, but had notable and concrete achievements to her name. Objective 1 for the Highlands, the Erasmus scheme. She brought the Lomé Convention to the Highland capital. But her real achievement was transformation. She transformed the whole context of Scots politics. She tilted the political world on its axis. Would there have been any reconvening of our Parliament but for Winnie Ewing? Highly debatable, perhaps even doubtful. Above all, and shining like a beacon, was her generosity of spirit, for friend and foe alike, something that the people sensed and reciprocated in full measure. She was Madame Écosse. From Alex and myself and all at the show, we hope you enjoyed this week's very special tribute to the late great Winifred Ewing, and we hope to see you all next week.
And I want to start with words I've always wanted either to say or hear someone say. The Scottish Parliament adjourned on the 25th day of March in the year 1707 is hereby reconvened.